Welcome back. All right, so it's been about 3.5 years since I did a video strictly on the NHL's playoff format. It's a discussion we had every year, and the reason that I am bringing this up is because as we're into a new collective bargaining agreement, which officially kicks in next year, but we've already seen the LTIR changes take place this year. For some fans and for some players, it's frustrating. It's frustrating that the playoff format will remain the same. Gary Bettman has defended the playoff format for years. And in putting this board together and in looking things up back to 2014, Gary Bettman's never wavered. He's never wavered in his opinion that the system that we have for the playoffs currently is the best system. But I wanted to get into why as well, because sometimes it gets missed on why they changed the playoff format. And that gets interesting too, because some of the articles I was reading, I was like, but we'll get into that. So I wanted to go all the way back to the 1967 expansion. And when you go from 6 teams to 12, obviously you're not going to just have 4 teams in the playoffs anymore. It became 8. 4 in the West, 4 in the East. Now, everybody in the West, brand new teams. Everybody in the East, that's your original 6. So definitely, I would think some discussion about how unfair that may have been, that there were teams in the West that were making the playoffs that wouldn't have had a chance in the East because those are your original 6 teams, whereas against other expansion teams, you have a better chance. Now, the NHL eventually gets this right. They move Chicago to the West, and also crossover matchups make it fair, meaning that first place on one side meets fourth on the other, second meets third on the other, etc., meaning you could end up with all original 6 teams occupying the 4 semifinal spots. So that seemed to work pretty well, but the league is expanding and expanding and expanding. So 1975, we have an 18-team league, and that means that the 1975 playoffs are expanded. So the division winners get a bye. And honestly, if the NHL decided to do some sort of an expansion to the playoffs, I wouldn't mind seeing something like this come back. Remember, this is something the NHL has done before, so this is not some crazy out-of-the-world idea they've never tried. So the division winners got a bye. There were 4 division winners. The other 8 teams, so the next 8 in terms of performance, they would play a best-of-3 preliminary round. So the division winners were waiting on them. The preliminary winners are then re-ranked for the next round. So your best of the preliminary winners would face off against the lowest rated of the 4 division winners and whatnot. And then you would continue from there, right, with a bracket system. That continued until 1980's playoffs. 1980 and 1981 playoffs were different. They were 1 versus 16, 2 versus 15, etc., etc. It did not last. Travel was a nightmare. There's one first round in 1980 where Vancouver's playing Philadelphia, and then in 1981 Vancouver played Buffalo. So that's not optimal for first round matchups, and it didn't last. Now that was after the WHA teams were brought in. You had a 21-team league, meaning you could play every other team in the league 4 times, twice at home and twice on the road. I have no idea why they even bothered having divisions for those 2 years. It didn't matter. 1 versus 16, 2 versus 15, a completely balanced schedule. The divisions legitimately meant nothing. So that lasted 2 years because of the fact that it was a logistics nightmare. And 1 versus 16, 2 versus 15, I don't think we ever see that come back. Then 1982, we go to the divisional setup. So 4 teams in each division qualify. The first round of the playoffs was best of 5, best 3 out of 5. And that lasted for 5 years. 1987, it became best of 7 for everybody in the first round because, or best of 7 in the first round because there was some consideration given to the idea that it is easier for an underdog to win 3 out of 5 than it would be for them to win 4 out of 7. Is that accurate? I don't think so. I think there's always that idea that you want to make sure that you are favoring the higher ranked team, but sometimes the higher ranked team just doesn't want it as much. Sometimes that lower rated team, it doesn't matter if they're on the road, they're at home, they're better. They match up really well with them. So even after they changed from a best of 5 to a best of 7 in the first round, we still saw upsets from 87 on. Then 1994, we have 1 versus 8 introduced. And it was a revolutionary idea. It really did change the way the playoffs worked. Of course, 94, we see the Canucks and the Rangers meet in the final. On the way there, the Canucks benefited from the 2-3-2 setup. So if it was a Central Division team against a Pacific Division team, as was the case with Vancouver against both Dallas and Toronto, it meant that you played a 2-3-2. So the home team for games 1, 2, 5, 6, and 7, that was the higher seed. Games 3, 4, and 5 were played in the arena of the lower seed, which means if you're the lower seed, just get a split in the first 2 games and then don't lose at home, and you're good. And that's generally what happened. It seemed to favor the lower seeds going to a 2-3-2 setup. So it became optional in 1995 if a Central Division team was against a Pacific Division team, and nobody took that option. Nobody. And the option was given to the higher seed. So the higher seed could look and go, well, we could do a 2-3-2. Nobody wanted 2-3-2. It was not of interest to them. So we had the system from 1995 right up until 2014 where things change, which is 1 versus 8, and it's the one that a lot of people want to go back to. 2014, we got back to divisional playoffs, and of course, we have the wild cards added. I think the wild cards, that's one thing that I kind of wish we'd had back in the 80s. The Norris division was a lot of fun to watch. There was a lot of fights, but clearly the Smythe division was better than the Norris division at points in time. As in the Smythe division winner would usually run over the Norris division winner. There were definitely times too where the Patrick division, which had a lot of the teams that are now in the Metro division, teams would miss the playoffs in the Patrick, who would have made the playoffs in the Adams, the division that they were up against there in the East. And so there was always that chance that a team might miss the playoffs that should under other circumstances, and a team might make the playoffs that wouldn't if they were in the other conference. It's just been the way of things. But going to the divisional playoffs, there were reasons given at the time, which really haven't changed from the National Hockey League's perspective. It's meant to encourage rivalries. The interesting part is, from 94 till 2014, I don't remember there being a lack of rivalries. I seem to remember Detroit and Colorado not liking each other, even though we had this setup that wasn't divisional. We still did have repetitive matchups. That was still a thing. Maybe not as bad as now, but we did. We still had teams that played each other a lot and saw each other in the playoffs almost every year. That I don't think that's as big a deal sometimes as people make it out to be. And the idea that, well, we got to play a really strong opponent in the first round, I mean, we can get into the idea that upsets happen. Like yesterday, for instance, I do the video on the standings. And looking at last year's standings, teams are close to one another. There's a lot of parity in the regular season. Playoffs are a whole different ballgame. Seems there's certain teams built for the playoffs that are able to turn it on and certain teams that can't. And that's a whole other discussion for a whole other time. But it does mean you're going to get a lot of rematches. Even in conference finals, we've seen rematches over recent seasons. And that wouldn't necessarily change under 1 versus 8. Rivalries are still going to be there. Early matchups. This is the one I wanted to talk about, and this is why I'm doing a whole video on this. Early matchups of teams in the same time zone. Jim Lights, owner for the Dallas Stars, way back in a 2015 article I was reading, was talking about how ratings for Dallas's playoff games had dropped by 60%. And his theory was because they were playing teams on the West Coast and games weren't starting until late. Okay, what happens in the playoffs now? In the first round, how many times do we see games in Minnesota, games on the prairies here in Canada, games in Dallas, where normally your start time is 5 o'clock Pacific or 8 o'clock Eastern, and suddenly your start time is an hour and a half, 2.5 hours later. Like, it's been insane watching as teams that are in the middle of the continent kind of get screwed up by the way that the schedule is done. And so I thought that was an interesting point being made here of, hey, our ratings drop when we're playing against teams that are in a later or in the Pacific time zone. So if we could stay away from starting those games that late, that would help the ratings. Yeah, it would. So it's one of those interesting things to me is that the NHL clearly has an idea where during the playoffs, you're able to watch a game, and as that game's coming to an end, you can watch the next. Fine, I don't have a problem with that, but I do think for teams in the middle of the continent and having to start an hour and a half after their normal start time, you don't necessarily lose home ice advantage, but that's one of the things home ice advantage should provide you is you're in your home building, you're starting on your normal start time, and players don't have to change their daily routines. Players are superstitious. They don't like changing their daily routines. Now, divisions were revamped in 2014, and we got back to every team playing every other team twice, minimum. And that's something that owners don't ever want to lose. So when we talk about expanding and everything, owners do not want to lose every single team coming into their building at least once. You don't want teams in the West don't want to go without seeing Crosby. Teams in the East are going to want to see, once Bedard's a superstar, they want to see McDavid too, and Edmonton and all that. So the idea of having every single team come into your building is part of the reason why we end up with this kind of a format to the schedule, which this was revamped at the time that they brought in the system we have now. Complaints have honestly continued from 2014 until now. The earliest I could find an article complaining about the setup, and it's usually 2 versus 3 that makes people angry. That 2 teams in a division are fantastic, and that third team's pretty good too. Well, hey, if you went back to 1 versus 8, these teams aren't going to be playing against each other right away or this early in the playoffs, which is valid in the event that you don't get upsets. But we do usually see upsets. All the division winners were out in the second round this year, right? So just being a top seed doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to win come the postseason. But I understand where people are coming from. And the complaints are definitely there. Bettman's never changed his view on this. The new collective bargaining agreement doesn't give any kind of verbiage to the idea of changing the playoff format. Broadcasters, it's also been said, prefer the bracket system over the old system. So you might have a Game 7 between Seed 1 versus Seed 8, and as a result, maybe the other matchups are already settled. However, you can't have a full bracket because you don't know if team number 8 is going to win or team number 1, because that's going to change all the seedings. It's going to mess around who's playing who. Broadcasters like to be able to really promote the upcoming matchups, and they like to have some predictability about who's going to play against who. I guess this is how it's been put. And so the fact that the broadcasters are saying they want it a certain way means it probably stays that way. And Gary Bettman loves this system as well. So as long as Bettman's in charge, I can't see there being any sort of a change unless the Board of Governors wanted a change. If the Board of Governors came forward tomorrow and said, we would like to see a change to the playoff format, that's where things might start to look a little bit different. Now, I've seen people advocating for adding a play-in round. I'd rather not. The 2020 playoffs were a unique setup where 24 teams technically played postseason games. I'm not sure why it's called a play-in round in 2020 when all those stats count as playoff stats anyways, but, you got to have the stats somewhere. I'd rather not see the play-in. I wouldn't be surprised if we see it, provided the NHL expands past 32 teams. And I know the flood of opinion on that is largely negative, but from the National Hockey League's perspective, money. So, money or money. They really do seem to like the money side of it. So, if they do add more franchises, we might see some sort of an addition of a play-in. The other reason I'd rather not see the play-in is because now you're setting up a situation where at the trade deadline, you might not get any movement hardly at all. The number of teams that are willing to maybe sell at the deadline could drop off precipitously, and you could end up in a situation where players just don't move anymore. And there's no excitement after the trade deadline, or very, very little, comparatively speaking. And we've already seen the trade market largely quiet over the last few years, the flat cap having done that, and now it just seems like GMs want to hold on to what they have. They prefer the devil they know over the devil that they don't. So the 84-game schedule comes in next year. The 84-game schedule is designed to make sure everybody plays divisional opponents a set amount of times. For example, over the recent years, I've seen complaints that the Islanders and the Rangers only play 3 times against each other every other year. Rivalries, you're only going to get 3 Battle of Albertas, every other year. 4 during the year opposite that. But with the new setup of 84 games, you're going to play everybody in your division 4 times. And everything else stays the same. Now, the earlier start means that we should get the Stanley Cup awarded in the middle of June, which I think people are going to be happy about. I love the idea of having at least a week between the end of the playoffs and the draft. I absolutely, that is great. That's something I've always wanted. It's weird to me that the Stanley Cup is awarded and then like a couple of days later it's the draft and a few days after that it's free agency. The NHL takes all of the exciting parts of the year and squashes them into like a 10-day period. And then the rest of the year is not a lot of movement and all that. Now, getting back to the playoff setup, personally, I'd love to see 1 versus 8 come back. I think that was the system that worked pretty darn well. I understand the league wanting the bracket system, that the bracket system works really well for them. And you do have a set bracket with the way the playoffs are now, which is with 1 versus 8, as I mentioned. You don't really, because you do get those upsets, and then it changes who's seeded where and who's playing against who. Because while we as fans, we enjoy the not necessarily knowing who's going to play who in the next round. Like, okay, if Chicago wins this round, then they're going to play against this team, but that they may not, because that team's, and so they may end up with this, and you may have 3 different options for who a team might play, which is entertaining. Not going to say it's not, but the NHL likes that certainty, and they really seem to like the divisional rivalries, which, considering how the first round of the playoffs is almost always the best round of the playoffs, that adds to the argument that the NHL makes here. The fact that we say, well, the best part of the playoffs are the first round, that's music to the ears of Gary Bettman. If the hockey was bad, if every series was a sweep, or if the series were boring, the NHL might be more likely to look at some sort of a change, but it generally is some of the most exciting hockey in that first round, and that's been the case throughout. So that's part of the reason why, from the NHL's perspective, 2 versus 3 works. So, yeah, we'll see how things go from here. I wore Carolina for this because I did see people looking at my standings video and go, you can't stand Carolina. I didn't let opinion get into it very much really at all. In fact, at the end, I did the subjective one, and I put Carolina at number 1. But anyways, I will be interested to see if we see a change when Gary Bettman's time is done as commissioner, if we see a change in commissioner lead to a change in the attitude towards the playoff format. I don't think it's changing. I think it's interesting that we have a new collective bargaining agreement, and from all reports, the playoff format really wasn't a point of discussion. So from a player's perspective, they might prefer to go back to a 1 versus 8 kind of setup, but it's not something that it looks like they're going to go out and fight for a collective bargaining agreement. It's not something they're willing to go onto a lockout situation with or go on strike over, but it is something that fans would like to see, a playoff format where it's 1 versus 8. So I know that if I did a poll, that probably 85-90% of the poll would be for 1 versus 8. But I will be interested to see if we do see some sort of an expansion. Are we going to see some sort of an expansion to the playoff? And the expanded playoff argument goes back well over 20 years. So it is something that has been talked about for a very long time. I want to say Kevin Lowe talked about it when he was GM of the Oilers a long time ago. And the idea of a play-in was brought up then. I don't think we get there, not under Gary Bettman. But it will be interesting to see if, as some of the owners change too, and the people in charge of the Board of Governors are different people, we'll see if the NHL's appetite for change is there when it comes to the playoff format. At this point, it doesn't appear to be the case. But let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, as always. Hit like and subscribe in the event you may not have done so already. And so, yeah, I understand the rivalries. I also understand the playing against teams that are in the same time zone you are. Although, as I said, that one's kind of an iffy one. But let me know your thoughts. Do hit like and subscribe. Thank you guys so much for all your support as always. I will talk to you again soon.